Hey everyone, I'm Gregg, lead designer here on World of Tanks for the console, the Xbox, and the PS4. And I'm going to take you guys through some of the ways we do tuning and balancing in World of Tanks. This video is being recorded for Extra Life and beyond, so I don't know when you're watching it. But if it is for Extra Life, I'll be on much later during Extra Life, and you can ask me Q&A based on what you're seeing here, because this is pre-recorded. And if you're not for Extra Life, enjoy the show. All right, moving on to the next slide. I'm actually doing a PowerPoint, so you'll hear me say stuff like, next slide, so enjoy that as well. Hey, who the heck am I? I introduced myself, but what does that mean to all of you guys? I'm the lead designer here for World of Tanks on the Xbox, which is the 360 and the Xbox One, as well as PS4. I've been rolling around in the game industry since '93. I actually started as a quality assurance in Sega of America back in the Genesis Mega Drive days for those of you who remember cartridges. And then I worked my way up into design from QA and testing into production, associate production, and then just wanted to be part of the creative kind of element of games. So now I'm a designer and a lead designer. And going on to the next. What is all the tanks? That's what you're about to see. That's what I named this presentation. There's some important points with this as we go along because I'll use some terms frequently, so I'm just kind of giving you an idea of what they are. If you ever hear me mention something called the depot, which is on screen right now, it's our collections of all things that make up a tank. It's the tuning data, it's the art, which is the collision, the textures, the animations, the wiggle bits, all that good stuff. Inventory data, like what consumables, equipment, all that good stuff can the tank use. All of that, that's what the depot is. So if you hear me using that generically, that's what that is. So on to the next, how many tanks are there currently? The answer, which may surprise you, or might not, I don't know what your guess was, there are 641 tanks in the game right now. Now that doesn't include 641 tanks that you can play right now. That includes AI tanks we've made. That includes some test tanks that are purely for test and will not be seen in the retail environment, which is what I call what you guys see when you're playing the game. But there's 641 of those guys, and they all have to be balanced or adjusted according to where they live and what their role is in the game. Moving on. How many ammunition loadouts do you think are in the game? So I'm pointing this out just in terms of the volume of stuff that Wargaming and the designers have to balance. I'm not referring to types of shells. I'm referring to each individual shell that can be mounted on any tank. There's a little scale picture there for you. And the answer is 907. So there are a lot of different types of shells you can send downrange. And it is our responsibility to make sure that they all are fulfilling their goal, regardless of which tank is shooting them. So to move on from there, just to go to an even bigger number and a bigger set of variables we need to tune. How many packages or tank configurations are in the game? Now, packages, tank configurations, those are how you upgrade your tank. And even in some cases with tanks with multiple guns that may have different kind of play styles, how do you pick those different guns with the engine and the hull and the chassis and all that good stuff that you want on your tank? So remember, each tank has at least one, like a premium tank, even though in your view, it doesn't have anything you can pick. That counts as one package according to the way the system's set up. There are 3,424 packages in the game. So 641 tanks with over 3,000 packages, all of which have to make sense in terms of their progression down the line and fit into the balance according to their class and tier. A lot of stuff. Packages I was mentioning, the next thing we're looking at here is how many modules are there that are contained in these over 3,000 packages. And remember, modules are the guns, the turrets, the chassis, the engine, the fuel tanks, and the radios. How many of those are in the game? The answer there is 4,043. So that is a lot of things that go into a lot of packages that go into a lot of tanks. I'm telling you all this because it kind of gives you a purview of whenever we change one thing, it impacts thousands of other things. Maybe not directly because they're not tied to the exact same numbers, but they all fight each other, right? So whenever we touch a tier, like let's say tier 5 anything, all the other things in that battle tier that fight that tier 5 something we changed are now related to that new number. They're either better than it, equal to it, different than it, or worse than it, depending on what we do. So moving on. Making tanks. That was just a lot of numbers thrown at you. It's kind of a volume introduction. But what do we do when we make tanks? I'll walk you through that. So if we go past this making tank slide, there we go. How does a tank start? Where does it come from? It can be an inherited tank. You'll see here I have a PC model of the T95 at the time of this filming. This was originally done in September 2017. And then you also see there on the PS4/Xbox One the T95 models compared. It could be an inherited tank that we rebuilt for the console version. It could be a hero tank, like right there we see our Freedom. The hero tank is usually a variant or very similar to a premium tank that already exists. Or it could be a tech tree tank that became a premium hero tank. Moving on. It could be a console exclusive tank. We have here the AMX Chaffee. For those who know and love it, I'm a big fan of this. I'm a light tanker. It's a fun tank. We got ourselves a French turret and gun, and we got ourselves a USA chassis and hull. It could be an event mode tank. We're looking at the Mark I male here, but there's also the toy tanks for the holiday. Togboat, for those who remember that special April Fools. The Lunar, which we all love on Mars and on the moon. The Spectre and all the awakened monster tanks, all that good stuff. Those are event mode tanks. And so on and so forth. So first of all, we have to figure out where's the genesis of this tank. What makes up this tank once we have its origin story. Now, you're going to see the T95 a lot here. I just picked it as an example tank because it's my presentation, so enjoy. One of the most important things is the collision, and here we're looking at the T95 collision. And one of the cool features that came online not so long ago, I believe, was the armor viewer and the module viewer in the garage, and this is very similar to that. Collision is really important because above and beyond numbers, like how thick is your armor, how much penetration does your shell do, the angles all matter in terms of where you hit. So we can see a T95 here as the game sees it in terms of collision. And this is the same if you're in the Xbox environment, whether you're on the 360 or the Xbox One. And why is that? That's because I want, and we all want, and you want, to shoot the exact same thing regardless of what piece of hardware you're running on, right? We don't want an exploit where it'll shoot through a piece of armor that someone's viewing or hit where there is no viewing or rendered model. That would be terrible. So the collision is the same across everything. Moving on from collision, by the way, I'm now looking at the modules and the collision of the modules. You see where the crews are, you see where the tracks, the gun are, because as your shells penetrate or your HE shells pierce the armor of your foe, it actually checks with different types of collision and bounce. What modules does it hit? Did it do damage to those modules? How much damage did it do to that modules? They're actually physically represented in the tank. And again, I encourage you to look at your armor viewer and module viewer in your World of Tanks and check this stuff out. It's really informative. So underneath or over that, depending on how you look at it, is the actual models, the actual visual coolness you see and love in terms of tanks. We have SD models, which are for the Xbox 360. Right here, we're looking at the SD model of the T95. We have HD models, and right now we're looking at the HD model of the T95. You can see that the armor and the tracks are multiple pieces. There's just more detail. I'll switch really quick to the SD. I'm looking at the SD again. And if you, a really good place, you can look at all these areas. But if you look at the tracks on that T95, and here now I've switched back to the HD version, you can see how it's actually two tracks on either side of that T95. Just an example of how the aesthetic is more representational of the actual vehicle, how it existed or would have existed in the case of a blueprint vehicle. After that, after we have a tank that you can collide with and looks cool, we figure out what its economy is and where it is in terms of progression. Is this a premium tank? Is this a tech tree tank? Is this an event tank? Where does it live? And I have the T-95 highlighted on this slide. You can see Tier 9 USA tank destroyer. It's one of my favorites. Again, enjoy it. You're going to be seeing a lot of it as we go. That actually makes a big difference in terms of its power level and how much it should make and how much it should cost to get. What we're looking at now is I'm past the tech tree we were just looking at. This is how the game sees the T-95 in terms of the list of US vehicles. This is an actual cut and paste from our XML code that's on the client. You'll see I've hidden the ID from you. I don't know why. I just put question marks. Enjoy that. But it's got the user strings, the price, tags, which are actually how the data knows what kind of vehicle is this, what equipment, consumables, all that kind of stuff can fit on the tank, and also what is denied from this tank. For instance, you know how you can't put equipment on an event tank like the toy tank? We actually have no equipment allowed that'll go in that tag field, and that's how we do it. And also what tier it is, which according to the game is known as its level. Here's the next slide. This is actually the package view as the game sees it for the T-95. You can see we got 3 packages there, and each package has the name of the package and the modules that are contained within that package, as well as what is unlocked by that package. Is it a second package or is it a new tank? So that's where all that data lives. And then we look at broad stroke statistics. So let's say I made that T-95. I have the economy all set up. Everything you guys have been watching and listening to me blather about now exists. Now we take a huge list of all of the modules and all of their hard and soft stats that all live in a beautiful spreadsheet and figure out how to balance this accordingly. Now, what you're looking at now are guns for low tier light and medium tanks, but that's essentially how it existed at the time of the authoring of this document. I didn't show tier 9s because it's a lot more vehicles, and this is exemplary of what I'm talking about. But we start doing broad stroke statistics. Is what's our best guess of how this vehicle should behave based on the shape of the vehicle and where it lives in our ecosystem and power curve. Then we play test the bejesus out of it. So here you see someone shooting their T-95 or reloading their T-95, and someone's calling for help. We're doing some play testing. We'll find things I almost guarantee that are garbage about this tank the first time we play it. There'll be a number that we made way too big or that we just missed and there's bugs. And so we play test it a lot, both internally and super test, common test, depending on what stage we are. And we'll go back. We'll change models if necessary. We'll change numbers. We'll do all that good stuff all through play testing. And then we just have to run it through the same pipeline again. Is where does it exist? How did that change the power curve? How did it change those thousands of packages and shells and modules and hundreds of tanks when we changed one number on the T-95? And here, if you're curious, is actual code and math that is another method of testing and balancing. We actually run the tank through several different programs to see how it would simulation-wise perform. I've actually blurred this out and wrote redacted, because if I were you, I'd be pausing this video and really zooming in and trying to figure out exactly what I'm looking at. And I'm afraid I can't show you that. I can show you that it exists, but I can't show you the exact details, or else Pain God would burn me alive, and I don't want to burn alive. Here's another redacted shot that I've moved to. This is more of the formulas, more of the code that you're going to look at. And here's a third one that's even bigger. It's redacted in big, angry font. A lot of math, a lot of code, a lot of not just subjective feedback through play testing, but running it through computers and seeing where the balance is actually laying. So I've gone on to the next. Let's say I did all that. We're looking at the maintain tanks section of this presentation now. We've shipped this tank. We got a T-95 in the ecosystem. Great. Everyone is researching up to it. They love big guns. They love slow American death sticks. And they want to go shoot other tier tanks in their battle tier range. We are watching constantly all of those analytics and deciding if there is a problem, deciding what the problem is, and deciding how and if to address the problem based on its severity. And I'm going to walk you through that entire process because I think it's really important, and I'd be curious if I wasn't involved in the design every second of every day. So the first thing we look at on the maintaining tanks is the win-loss. And we always start from a really orbital macro level of data and work our way down details until we find the very specific thing that is either a problem or something to discuss. So what I'll do to show you that right at the beginning is we're looking at the percentage of wins by nation. And I believe this data was collected a month before September for both ecosystems, PlayStation and Xbox. So you can see here every nation that existed at that time and their rough win-loss rate in random battle. And you can see it's pretty dead even. There's a slight advantage for the Czechoslovakian tank. Wow. Rebooting voice. Czechoslovakian tanks. Sorry about that. And you could, I guess, slightly perceive a imperceptible disadvantage for Germany, maybe? But like, this isn't telling us a lot, because if you're watching this video, you know how many tanks are in the German line, so you can't act on any of this, right? It's a giant orange column saying there might be a problem there. But it's a good place to start, and it's kind of interesting. So let's keep moving down. So again, remember the dates I told you for when this data was gathered, but during those dates, pre-September 2017, here is all the Tier 9 vehicles in terms of daily ownership divided by class. So for all the Tier 9s, I used the T95, that's why we're dealing with Tier 9 here. You can see everyone out there really loves their heavy tanks, and AT-SPG is what the game calls tank destroyers, is almost the bottom, except nobody seems to be owning those Tier 9 TDs. Or I'm sorry, SPGs. That could be because there's less SPGs per nation per tier. Some nations don't have SPGs, but you can kind of see the breakdown of ownership. This becomes important on why we're not just looking at the win-loss stats, but the ownership as I go on. Keep that in mind. Their popularity matters. Number of battles cross compared with popularity. This is just words. The bigger it is and the angrier red it is, the more popular it is. We're still dealing with Tier 9. You guys love your E75. You're all over it. That G55 underscore is just a take designator for the code and the data, so we know when we're changing art or balance or whatever, we don't have to figure out E75 what, package what. We could just say the G55 has a problem, fix it. And you can also say the 212A, the Russian Tier 9 Arty, is not getting much love here. So you can see who is playing as well as owning all of these tanks. Keep it on moving on. All right, we just looked at who's playing and owning those tanks. And here we are looking at a little more detail. Remember how I told you we're starting big and going smaller and smaller, more detailed, more specific? Now we're looking at average daily owned tanks by tank, Tier 9 tank destroyers only. If you look here, you can see the T-30 and the Jag Tiger. A lot of people are owning that sucker. And the Foch and the S12254, not as many. And the T-95 is about the 10K mark. That's a good, decent daily battle kind of ownership ranking. One of the things I may or may not have mentioned, and I will mention again, is you are actually looking at screenshots I took of our analytic interfaces in Tableau. This is the real deal, and I don't think this has been shown before, so I'm really excited to have gotten permission from Pain God to be able to show you guys this stuff. This is really cool. Moving on from the Tier 9 popularity, we check the earn rates. One of the classic ways to see if a tank is over or underperforming is how much is it making? How much XP? How much free XP? How much silver? How much crew XP is this thing making? And based on what we see here, it's a pretty good grouping. Everything is more or less in the same for all of these tanks. I'm pretty satisfied with these, but if we found something that was really high or really low, we'd take a look at that, because that doesn't mean it's over or underperforming. It might just mean its earn rates need adjusting. But this is something we do check, because you can incentivize or disincentivize use of any tank by either increasing or maintaining its earn rate. We are loath, I'll throw another loath in there, to nerf tanks unless absolutely necessary, because you've either spent a ton of your time, or let's be really honest here, your money on this tank, And there is an expectation and a promise once you've acquired that tank that it is stable and good and works for the game. So we don't use all this data to like crush a tank that just because, oh, this number's big, crush it. We are looking at these numbers to make sure everyone's experience is awesome, whether or not you own this tank. So that's just another data point I come in here. As we pass up the earning, we also look at the win-loss. So here we have per day average percentage win or loss for all of the Tier 9 tank destroyers. You can see red is basically over the norm. Doesn't necessarily mean overpower, just means bigger. And blue is a lower number. That's a cool way to see really quick where you see the problems are. Then you can dig in and see what the actual percentage is. So here you can see it's about average. We've got the S122-54 that had a couple bad days there, and we had the AMX-50 Foch that had a couple good days there. But what you generally want is the colors to be about even, unless you're specifically designing this stat to be different for that tank, because not every tank is created equal, right? So if we move on from win-loss, we get to number of battles and popularity. And this matters a lot with win-loss and also matters a lot with why I'm talking about ownership and playtime. Here you can see that Waffentrager off PZ4 is being played a lot more than, say, the S122-54. Why does that matter? We could have, on a low battle count tank, much more proficient players that know how to play it, that are actually skewing some of its numbers to be higher. In general, the bigger the number the battle count is, the more consistent and statistically relevant any of the stats we gather for that tank are. You can have a tank that not many people are playing that looks like it's either doing incredibly well or incredibly terribly, totally swayed by that person's skill. And I'll get to how we also measure skill. It's kind of interesting. But this is why battles and popularity matter. Moving on from that, survival rate. At the end of a battle, are you still alive in this tank or not? And what's the percentage chance? Now, again, remember, blue means lower, red means higher. We can see that we have a Waffentrager, and there's that T95, bright red, man. That thing's got armor for days. It also is usually a sniping tank. They tend to live a lot longer, but that FE 4004 Conway, it's getting dropped a lot more. Is that a problem or not? It might be, it might not be. It's just, again, winnowing into that more detail. Or is it this tank is performing as expected? Are we expecting this tank to have a higher survival rate? Does that mean it's killing more? No, it doesn't. It just means it's having a higher survival rate. We have to look at all the data, and you're looking behind the hood here. So here's your lifespan. And again, you can see the T95 is crushing it here in terms of time alive. Everything else is more or less the same. There's a couple guys that die quicker. But look at that T95, man. If you want to live the longest in a Tier 9 tank destroyer, the T95 is clearly statistically your best chance at doing that. Just interesting, because the longer you're alive, the more chance you have to do damage compared to your reload rate. So, and how quickly you can get into the fray. All sorts of variables all tie together. So there's the survival rate per tank per day. Moving on, here's damage blocked. And again, you can see the T95 is blocking a whole ton of damage. One thing you can also see is the Waffentrager PZ4 is blocking embarrassingly low damage. Like, we're talking single digits here, which means you hit that sucker, it's probably going to pop like a zit. Or at the very least, you'll penetrate and damage it a little. The T95, people are shooting it and either don't know where to shoot it, or just getting really unlucky, or just hitting its thick armor and it's blocking a lot of damage. So if you want to laugh at people as their shells bounce off you, again, T95 looks like a decent choice. If you want to rely more on maneuverability, just keep in mind when you're using some of those blue tanks there, you're not going to block as much damage. Moving on to damage caused per shot that connects and penetrates. We slice damage and shots and accuracy several different ways. I'm showing you this one because this is a measure of damage average per shot that not only connects with a foe, actually penetrates their armor so that bounces don't reduce this number and its average. Again, look at that object 704. I wonder if a bunch of people are going to start jumping in the 704 because that thing, once it pens, is doing a hot load of damage. And the tortoise, not so much. So one of the things I want to point out is damage output per shot does not mean in or out of balance. Each one of these tanks has a job, has its own place in the triangle of speed, armor, damage output, and we have to make sure that's all balanced within all the other tanks in the ecosystem. Based on what I'm showing you, which is solely tank destroyers, that would be a flawed way to make a decision, because when's the last time you played a match with 30 tank destroyers? I'm not going to say that's not impossible, but incredibly unlikely, especially when you remember the slide way back when, in terms of how many heavy tanks versus mediums versus lights, no tier 9 lights at the time of this recording, versus tank destroyers, SPGs, all that good stuff. So moving on. Damage caused per battle. Now this isn't per shot. This is your average damage once the battle's done. And you can see that same Object 704 is not only hitting like a bear once it penetrates, it's doing a lot of good damage when it does penetrate, and seems to be the king of damage per battle at tier 9 TDs. I should play my 704 more, it seems like. This is all the data that we look to see how the tanks are performing. But I do want to touch, and by the way, if I start taking pauses and swallowing, I'm talking to you guys a lot. I'm really enjoying this. My throat's getting dry. That's how much I love you. One of the things I did talk about, now that I've passed the love, is skill. Now, how the hell do we manage to look at statistically what skill should skew in? And I'll show you. It's a good question. All right, so here we're cross-comparing skill. What you're looking at here is a mythical tank. This tank does not exist, but it is showing you graphs we look at. That orange line you're looking at is your average expected win rate based on your account's win rate. So if you're an account all the way on the right that wins 60% of the time, or 0.6 as this chart's showing you, this tank is also winning at 60% of the time. This is a perfect tank. It is exactly aligned with the ecosystem. Conversely, if you win only about 42% of the time, this tank is also allowing you to win 42% of the time. It is still a perfect tank. So this is how we compare your skill as an account compared to your prowess and your abilities and your results in this specific tank. So here, let me give you another example. I'm going to add a blue line. And blue line. All right, here's a blue line. Here is an underperforming tank. You can see across the skill rating, it is always lower than the average. So in this mythical tank, this again is not a tank that exists in our game. If you win typically 42% of the time, you're winning, what is that, 25, 30% of the time in this tank? It's even worse for you. Conversely, if you win 60% of the time, this is winning at, what, 50% of the time? It's also not living up to your true skill potential. This is a tank we would need to address, because it doesn't matter how good you are, this tank seems to be indicating you can't be comparable to how you normally behave in this tank. I've gone to the next slide. This is an interesting example that we have had in the past. I don't think we have any right now, where a tank can conceivably be terrible for the players that aren't as amazing. Like if you win 42% of the time and this specific mythical doesn't really exist tank, you win barely 25% of the time. You're getting crushed in this tank. However, if you're a pro, you're rocking it at off the charts. What is that, 80% of the time you win in this tank? A lot of times this is indicative of a tank that has a lot of skill behind it, that as soon as you jump in, it's too difficult to use and you die a lot, but once you figure it out, you can crush in it. Sometimes you might even call that an exploit. Once you figured out an exploit, you're going to all of a sudden sing. And until you know that exploit, you're just going to be a dumpster fire and your team's going to be mad at you. Again, this tank doesn't really exist. Let's look at a tank that really exists. Here we go. This is the T95. I told you we'd be looking a lot at it. This blue line is the T95. Now, this is very typical. When you get a line that's all over the place, normally this means don't touch it, because it's so much variance at each percentage point and nothing is egregiously bad. This is pretty close to average. At the time this data was taken, if you're not great at World of Tanks, if you're a 42%er, I'm not saying you are, whoever that person who's not you is out there, you're even worse than the T95, probably because it's slow to rotate. You have to really know where to aim. It hits really hard when you pull the trigger, but if you miss or bounce, man, you're in trouble because they know where you are, all that good stuff. Then it kind of raises and lower. If you're exactly an average player right in the middle, this is a good tank for you. This is slightly better than normal for you. And once you get into the higher skill areas, you see it takes a dip before it aligns again at the 60% at 60%. That is probably because once you're up in that range fighting other pros, they know where to shoot this tank. And even though you know what you're doing, they know what they're doing as well. They can track, flank, and nuke you. So that's probably what that means. But as soon as you get to 60%, you're doing A-okay there. You're meeting on target. So this is actually a really well-balanced tank. None of those dips are really concerning, but it might be worth watching the lower tier to see if we can consider anything and making sure that we preserve that high 60% win rate and make sure that doesn't dip. That's probably worth doing. Okay, we just looked at a lot of graphs, a lot of numbers, a lot of details on use, tank assembly, popularity, statistics for all sorts of different vectors on a tank, and including its earn and including how it's performing on the battlefield, and also omitting a bunch of other stuff we look at in terms of heat maps and all sorts of good stuff. I'm not trying to hide that from you. I'm just trying to give you a high level of how we approach these things. Now that we have all that data, what do we do with it? We look at this data to compile, change, test, and deploy like you're reading on the screen. What the heck does that mean? First of all, is there a problem? Do we see a problem? Has a problem either been reported in the forums? Has a problem been flagged by QA? Has a game developer playing the game say, hey, I see a problem? Yes, there's a problem. Is the problem impacting gameplay, the economy, or both? Is this tank super overpowered and mowing over everything in its battle tier that it faces, unstoppable, or can't even get a shot off before it's vaporized? Is this tank earning millions of silver per shot or 1 silver per battle? Is it terrible or great? What is the problem? Big to little to smaller to tiny to itty bitty. How big is this problem? Like if it should be earning 1,000, let's say that's its target, 1,000 either XP or silver, and it's earning 900, is that a huge problem? We'll have to have a discussion. Maybe we should bump its earn rate. Is it doing slightly more damage than we anticipated? Because like I told you in the beginning, all those other tanks and all their stats and armor, there was something there we didn't account for, like one of its enemies at the battle tier. Is it only when it faces that enemy or only when it's in the hands of a really, really pro player? How big is this problem? What factors are impacting the problem that we've seen now that we know its size? Is it the stats? Is it a number that's just too big or too small? The pen number's too big. Armor is too small. Is it the model? Is it the fact that we have an armor that's 90 degrees that should have been 33 degrees or whatever? Is it something other than these things I'm telling you about? Is the matchmaker throwing it into the wrong battle tier? Is it deploying the wrong package? It's just an outright bug. Is it invisible because we really screwed up? What is causing this problem? What are the factors? Once we have all that, try a solution. Let's say we've identified it's an armor angle. Let's try changing some of the armor angles, retexturing the model, see if that fixes the problem. Make sure the problem is specifically identified and try to see if it fixes it. That goes through the thing I told you about in terms of play testing and then more common testing and more super testing and then deployment and all that stuff. Test. I skipped ahead of my own slide. Number 6 is test, just like I told you about. Then let's say we're great. We're like, I think we fixed the problem. Let's get that out there. Everyone needs to enjoy this tank with its new edits. The armor angle in the case of the example I just gave. One thing that is really important as I'm talking about this, and you'll forgive me for the fancy text as I slide over here, you need to beware the arms race. Now, what do I mean by that? So I said earlier that we are really, really loath to nerf a tank unless absolutely necessary. There's no other way to change or to address this problem, and it's big enough that it's worth changing. The opposite of that is the arms race, where if you have a tank, it's not doing good enough. Let's raise this number. Now this tank feels terrible. Let's raise this number. Now this tank feels terrible. Let's raise this number until it's just millions and millions of numbers, meaningless data, and all those other thousands of modules and shells I pointed out all have to rise as well. I want to change one thing. The game development team wants to change one thing when there's a problem, not 8 million things. NERF only as a last resort. I can't stress that enough. So it does sometimes happen, no matter what we try, making a number different or bigger or gone is not enough. We have to make it smaller. Thankfully, right now, I can't think of a specific case where we had to do that. I can think of a case where we did it accidentally a long time ago when we upgraded a bunch of the German engines. We didn't upgrade them right, and a bunch of German tanks were really performing abnormally. We fixed that. But this really is a last resort. This is because, both of these things are because doing higher or lower damage, receiving more or less bounced shots, all that stuff, a spike does not mean out of balance. It just means different. So we have to make sure when we change anything that it fits into the ecosystem, the tank fulfills its desired role, and we don't create a ton of knockoff cases where we have to do an arms race, and we don't upset someone who's really, really worked hard on this tank or spent their money on this tank, and now it's different. So we're on the awesome thank you slide. I really want to thank you for listening, for watching, for enjoying this video. I do want to encourage you, if you are in the Extra Life crew, bring your comments. I will be on during the marathon, and I will try to answer as many as I can. If you happened upon this video, whenever you happened upon it, go to the World of Tanks forums, ask questions. Maybe some of the data you see here, almost certainly depending on when you watch it, is old. Maybe the numbers are different now. I show you the specifics at the September timeframe when this was recorded and authored. It's a living game as we add new tanks. The Swedish tanks weren't there when I made this. That'll change things. We'll see how things are different. We'll see how the ecosystem responds. I'm Gregg, lead designer, World of Tanks console, and thanks again for watching.